Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Irish Pharmaceutical Healthcare Association's Digital Think-In series. I'm Oliver O'Connor, the Chief Executive of the IPHA. This is the first of a series of 6 events we're running between now and the end of November. And as a Digital Think-In series, it's a new departure for IPHA. Obviously, for some time, we've been running virtual events, some for our affiliates, some for our members. But this is the first time we've packaged them into an integrated series that deals with various themes and strands of the medical innovation that we're all involved in the pharmaceutical industry. For well over 2 decades, of course, IPHA, our association, has run annual conferences to which we've invited many people and stakeholders over the years. But obviously this year we had to do something different, and we decided to take the best of those conferences and run them in a series of events which brings thought leadership to our members, to our affiliates, to our friends, to our stakeholders, and advances some of the themes and some of the topics that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, and we look forward to dealing with our stakeholders on in the coming months indeed. We wanted to bring you something engaging and something informative, some real thought leadership from our stakeholders, from our affiliates, from our friends, to inform all of us about where we're going with our industry, especially in the COVID times that we're now fully a part of. We hope you will like this new virtual delivery platform. We put it together with some really interesting work put into it to make sure that it works extremely well for you and for your engagement in the series over the next 2.5 months. In this event, we're partnering with IQVIA, the health data analysis firm it's an integral part of the ecosystem of pharmaceutical industry. IQVIA brings the key data and indeed insights and analysis from a vast array of sources, a vast array of information analytics that they bring to our industry. And they have some really fascinating insights for us this morning. Insights indeed that we hope we base our policy on, and indeed we hope our stakeholders will share with us as well. We will be examining the medicines reimbursement environment in Europe this morning and the new medicines pipeline as governments everywhere try to balance the need to meet clinical needs with rising healthcare costs caused by the pandemic. We in the association and among our members are extremely conscious of the challenges that governments everywhere, indeed Government of Ireland faces, and indeed our society faces in trying to manage both society and the economy through this extremely challenging time. We're very keen to play our part in that. Obviously, our main responsibility is to keep the supply of medicines going for the health service, for patients, for doctors, for clinicians everywhere, and indeed to invest in the innovation that will provide both vaccines and the therapeutic solutions for the pandemic. So over now to Gwyn Morley, General Manager at IQVIA Ireland, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Oliver, and thank you very much for including us in this Digital Think-In webinar series. We're delighted to be participating. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope all of you and your families are keeping well in these very challenging times. We all now know that that life isn't going to return to normal, that we're working with a disease that is going to continue to affect us globally for the foreseeable future. Hence, we now need to look forward at the healthcare environment and try to understand what the impact of the pandemic is going to be post, that kind of March, April, really significant time in Ireland, on how we're going to engage with our HCPs and our patients from a commercial engagement perspective, but also how the pandemic is going to affect the prospects of new growth medicines that are really companies' futures going forward. I'm joined this morning by my 2 colleagues, Sarah Rickwood and Lisa Taylor, who are going to share with you IQVIA's insights and some of their thoughts on these particular issues. Most of you in the audience will know Sarah. Sarah has presented in Ireland in numerous occasions at our IQVIA Strategic Market Reviews. Sarah has 28 years of experience as a pharmaceutical consultant, having worked in Accenture in their pharmaceutical strategy practice prior to joining IQVIA. Sarah has extremely wide experience of international pharmaceutical industry issues, having engaged with all the world's leading pharmaceutical companies across Europe, US, Japan, and the emerging markets. Sarah is the Vice President of Marketing, European Marketing and Thought Leadership Team, a team she's led now for 10 years. And she presents to hundreds of pharmaceutical clients every year on a wide range of global issues, and she publishes a numerous number of white papers on many topics. Sarah shall talk to you this morning about the Irish pharmaceutical environment and the impact COVID has had on that environment in 2020 and beyond. So welcome, Sarah. We're delighted you were able to join us this morning. Lisa Taylor has more than 20 years pharmaceutical industry experience, during which she has led over 250 consulting projects, as well as contributing to international conferences and publications. Lisa currently leads the IQVIA European Consulting Team from a strategic direction and operational direction of the EME consulting business, as well as a big focus on our centres of excellence in the areas of value and access, commercial models and launch, and asset and portfolio strategy. She has extensive EU and emerging market value and access experience and specific knowledge in the areas of innovative and partnering pricing strategies, for market access, forecasting and negotiation. Lisa previously worked in the pharmaceutical industry in Servier in various different roles across sales and marketing, and she also worked as a consultant in the chemical industry. So thanks again to Lisa as well for joining us this morning. She's going to discuss the funding of new and innovative medicines and the impact COVID will have on that funding. So just before I hand you over to Sarah, I just wanted to put into context our local market, what's happening in the Irish market and what our forecasts are for up to 2024. These forecasts were conducted towards the end of March, so don't necessarily factor in the impact of COVID, although you can see that drop in the 2020 growth on that yellow line. And if you look more closely at that, you can see that we're forecasting that the Irish market will continue to grow at about 3 to 4% over the next couple of years, hitting roughly about 3.4 billion by 2024. This growth is slowing because you can see, that spike in the growth in preceding years, and that was a similar growth spike that we saw across in other markets globally and across Europe. And it was really driven by the number of new molecular entities that were approved in 2017, 2018 by the FDA and by EMA. But if we look more closely at what's happening in 2020 in Ireland, I'm pleased to say that we're reporting that the demand is returning to normal. And we've seen this return to normal growth, or normal expectations in week 23. It has been very challenging. We did see that unprecedented spike in week 10 and week 11, where the market just went up to about 4.3 million units per week. Obviously, that was followed by quite a dramatic reduction in the volume of units, primarily driven by the fact that patients had collected a number of scripts. The number of new prescriptions presenting in retail pharmacy had dropped to below 60% from April and May, but also the fact that people were in lockdown and we were trying to manage that supply chain collectively. So it is very encouraging and hopefully we'll see a bigger uplift as we come into Q4. So now, without further ado, I will hand you over to Sarah Rickwood. Thank you.
I'm very pleased to be here. Reflecting on my photograph that Gwen introduced me with, and I'm looking at myself now, I can see clearly I still have something to do about down hair. But what I've also been doing, apart from growing hair in the last several months, is, of course, constantly about the question of COVID and what it means for the healthcare and pharmaceutical industries. So, in fact, I'm going to put Ireland in context here, because I'm not an expert on the Irish pharmaceutical market as such, but I do spend my time looking at the big questions about how the next few years are going to be playing out with respect to the healthcare market and pharmaceuticals as well. I'm going to start with the gloomy news, of course, and I think we have to face up to it. The fact of the matter is This is a crisis which is going to last for several years. And it's going to last for several years because actually it's not just one crisis. We've had the initial wave of COVID infections crisis. And for most of Europe, of course, we're past the first wave of that wave of infections and contemplating the possibility of a second wave, which of course increases uncertainty and risk. But we have to remember that actually probably between 50 and 60% of the global population are not even at the end of that first wave of infection yet. The wave of infection precipitated the second crisis, which is the healthcare system crisis. Healthcare systems in Europe, of course, managed to respond to and address that first wave of infections. In some cases, as in the case of North Italy, healthcare systems were extremely severely stretched during that time, and other healthcare systems coped by essentially shutting down the majority of non-essential to treat non-COVID patients. The challenge is that has built up a backlog. A recent article in the British Journal of Surgery estimated that during the 12 weeks of the peak of the crisis in the spring and early summer, a backlog globally of 28 million elective surgeries built up around the world. And in order to clear that backlog, healthcare systems would have to work for 45 weeks at 120% of normal capacity. Now, I think it's probably the case that healthcare systems are not even at 100% of normal capacity at the moment. Therefore, for non-COVID patients, there is almost certainly considerable backlogs in care across their treatment. And when we have interviewed oncologists, for example, across the EU5 countries, which we did in April and then did again in June after the peak of the first crisis, it's worrying for cancer, an area where patients really cannot wait, that we are seeing there is still lower than usual volume of visits and still there is a backlog as far as treatment, diagnosis, and other aspects of cancer care are concerned. So healthcare systems are stretched. Healthcare systems will continue to be stretched because of the backlog they need to address, which they need to do in an atmosphere of uncertainty and risk about the question of a second wave. One of the things that has been accelerated, which probably in the long term is actually positive for the healthcare environment, is the move to more remote healthcare provision, where that makes sense. During the height of infections, that was necessary, but patients and doctors have found that sometimes they find it more convenient. Again, if I go back to that oncology survey I just referenced, oncology cancer treatment is not an area which is generally remote in terms of doctor-patient interaction. Unsurprisingly, doctors want to be able to see patients to give them the news they need to give them in that area. And there were very, very few remote communications between doctors and patients across Europe in cancer before COVID. But doctors across the 5 major European countries, cancer doctors, do report that they'll still be seeing the majority of their patients face-to-face, but the minority that they engage with remotely, or the minority of occasions when they engage remotely, is going to rise significantly in that time. So there will be changes in the market as a result of that, and different healthcare priorities as well. Of course, after that second healthcare system crisis, the crisis that we are only starting to address is the question of economic crisis. Across the developed world, GDP fell in the first half of 2020. I believe that the European Commission predicts for Ireland that there will be a contraction of some 8% of GDP during 2020. The GDP contraction, which is predicted for the UK, is substantially actually higher. The economic crisis is going to be a multi-year crisis. Now, of course, healthcare and pharmaceutical industries have faced economic crises before. The Great Crisis, which was precipitated by the financial crisis of 2008, notably. And in fact, as an industry, we come out of crises stronger. If you think about it in a way, the last economic crisis was the crucible of today's more specialty-focused, innovative prescription medicine market. Because actually during that crisis, in around 2011 onwards, there was peak small molecule genericization for many primary care blockbusters. The challenge is that the size of potential savings from loss of exclusivity for the next 5 years as a proportion of total medicine spend is not going to be as high as it was in that last economic crisis. But nevertheless, the life sciences industries can weather economic crises on their own well, although there will be, and they will be challenging, and Lisa will talk about this a little later, payer constraints, of course, in consumer health areas, and areas where there are patient contributions, that will definitely impact as individuals have less money in their pockets. And longer term, there will be challenges against public and private investment. The difference here is we're not facing an economic crisis alone. We're facing this triple combination of continued infection, the healthcare system crisis of non-COVID treatments, and the economic crisis, all in an environment of risk and uncertainty around second and extended waves and timing and success of vaccine deployment. In the end, it will be pharmaceutical industry innovation that will get us out of this crisis, because it will be about a successful vaccine deployment. And that will happen, but there is still uncertainty, of course, about when. So, having made the case that this is a multi-year crisis, I'm going to make the case that that means that it will affect all aspects of the operation of a life sciences or a pharmaceutical company. Some of them, of course, we're seeing right now. If we think about the go-to-market model, the GTM model, we already know, and I'll show you data, that our engagements with healthcare professionals, and indeed healthcare professional engagement with patients, has been changed dramatically because of COVID. And whilst it is recovering and moving back, the fact of the matter is it is probably not going to be the same as it was in 2019. So patient engagement with doctors, those are near-term changes. It'll also be the case, and Lisa will talk about this more, that there are near-term changes as far as pricing and market access are concerned. And those will need to be responded to both tactically and in fact strategically as well. But on other parts of the pharmaceutical industry, around supply, manufacturing, regulation, and indeed the research and development pipeline, in the longer to mid-term, COVID will have impact here as well. On supply, one of the earliest concerns in relation to prescription medicines was the potential fragility of the global supply chain, and what the fact that the leading world manufacturer of API ingredients, China, went into the crisis first, would mean for the movement of those APIs to India, where much finished generics are made, and obviously thence into Europe. In fact, that crisis, by and large, did not materialize. There were, of course, local restrictions on specific products. The question of whether in the longer term manufacturing should move more back into the European sphere, particularly in the bulk active and generic manufacturing part of the market, remains a live one. And of course, Ireland is a huge manufacturing hub. But I think in the end, the supply chain globally did prove to be more resilient than some had feared. On the regulation side, one of the positive outcomes of the COVID crisis has been that regulators have shown, whether they're the FDA or the EMA, that they can be more responsive and move faster than they are generally used to move, because they're responding to a crisis. But perhaps some of that flexibility and speed will start to move into the longer term day-to-day regulation. And of course, changing times require different approaches when we think about the long-term impact of COVID. And lastly, on research and development strategy, we've seen, of course, an absolutely fantastic effort jointly by the whole of the pharmaceutical industry to both assess existing products and new products to treat COVID patients with severe COVID, but also to develop vaccines. And one of the positive aspects of that is it has reset public perception, in my view, of the pharmaceutical industry's value to people, to society. And we should make sure that we do not lose that enhanced status. It's also possible that it will change some of the directions of where research and development goes in the future. There is a renewed interest, and we're actually seeing approvals in this relation on developing products that enable patients to take their treatments themselves at home, staying out of facilities, or in the case of cancer, for treatment regimens that reduce the number of visits that patients need to take to healthcare facilities, reducing the burden on the healthcare system, obviously also the risk of infection. So it will change R&D as well. In the near term, for any company that's thinking about its portfolio of prescription medicines across the launch through growth, maturity and decline, all of these products, as we've seen during 2020, have the potential to be affected by COVID. But I would argue that it's the launch and the growth products that are particularly heavily impacted by the COVID crisis, both for the first part of 2020 and indeed for the rest of 2020 and into 2021. And the reason for this is the change in the ability of patients to interact with healthcare systems. We saw reduction in visits, and face-to-face visits are what has traditionally driven what I call a dynamic market. That is, new prescriptions for newly diagnosed patients and switch prescriptions for patients who aren't actually achieving treatment goals and need a new medicine. That is the vast majority of the prescriptions for launch products and much of the prescriptions for growth products. With mature and declining products, if you're chronic, obviously repeats are a substantial part of the market. As the dynamic market contracted, perhaps collapse is an overly dramatic term, but in some areas that really was true, but in other areas it contracts. The opportunity that launch and growth products had to continue to grow and establish reduced. Equally, and Lisa will talk about this, health technology and payer evaluations slowed down in some countries, not all, and that's part of the infrastructure that takes a product successfully to market. In the rest of 2020 and into 2021, if we pick up on that backlog idea, doctors are going to be very time pressured as they address the challenges of the healthcare system. And whilst it's less tangible, I'd argue that that is also a factor, because time-pressured doctors are going to be doctors who have less time to be open to new innovation. So a launch challenge. A challenge indeed across all kinds of stakeholders. This is subjective based on IQVIA opinion. But what we wanted to do was think about the way that COVID will change different stakeholders that are really important to pharmaceutical companies in terms of making major shifts in what they do and the way they interact with healthcare systems and indeed with pharma as well. The first point really is that changes are going to be very much region by region and country by country, because in the end, COVID-triggered changes are dependent upon the state of the healthcare system prior to COVID and also that particular country's COVID journey in the sense of how it has coped with the pandemic. But changes there will be in terms of different ways of doing things, whether for patients it's more actively engaging with their personal health, adopting remote technologies that enable them to manage their engagement with healthcare systems remotely, through to pharmacies in terms of e-pharmacy and increased home delivery, payers where the challenge will be about the reallocation of budgets and austerity in relation to budgets, and providers that may see a different approach to engaging with pharmaceutical companies or indeed with patients as well. So this is a perspective. It's not an objective, quantifiable fact, but I think that the point is that all of these things could see aspects of change. We've taken a view on where we believe Ireland might be in relation to the rest of the EU and other major parts of the pharmaceutical market. It needs to be understood because in the end, this is about where there will be substantial potential needs to understand a change in strategy. Let's move again to the question of launch, because one of the reasons why we've focused on this is the innovative launch of new active substances. That's the NAS. So these are novel small molecule and novel biologic compounds, is really the innovative lifeblood of the industry. And if this engine starts to stutter, then actually from a global overall pharmaceutical market perspective, we won't see much difference in the near term, but we will see a difference in the long term because this is the industry's future. Now, this is not about regulatory approvals by the EMA. It's about whether we see these new active substances coming in to our data on each of these markets. So the product could have been approved in 2019 and there could be lags, but obviously we would expect that at least some of these products were both approved and launched in 2020 as well. The long line is the 5-year average of cumulative new active substances being seen in our data over the year. And that varies between around 22 and 33 new active substances typically coming into these country markets per year. The shorter line is up to May 2020 for new active substances entering the data in this year. For 5 of these 6 countries, of course, we have the same regulator, the EMA. The UK left the European Union, but we see very different stories about the degree to which innovation is coming into the market. If we look at Germany, France, and Italy, actually, new active substances came in at or above historical levels. That doesn't necessarily say that they did well when they came into the market. That's another analysis and another story. But at least they were coming into the market. In Spain, UK, and yes, Ireland as well, that's not been the case. We see substantially fewer new active substances than the historical norm. In the UK, we'd expect that could be a combination of Brexit as well as COVID as well. But there are signs that in some countries, the crisis has had an impact on the introduction of innovation. And in the end, that will need to be actively addressed. Of course, this is not solely in the hands of pharmaceutical companies. Policymakers and payers need to be aware of this and they need to address it as well. But I'd like to reflect on some of the things that pharmaceutical companies can do when they're thinking about how they're going to be bringing products to market, launching products in 2020 and 2021. We do a lot of work on launch excellence, and some of these points are not necessarily new, but what COVID is doing once again is acting as an accelerant in terms of making changes. But there's three areas where I think focus needs to be intensified and changed to build successful launches in the future. The first is patient journey. We've talked about the backlog of patients that will affect areas where products launch. It's also apparent that there is a change in patient journeys. So the way that patients move through healthcare systems and their opportunities to receive new treatments. Because it's changed, it needs to be researched and understood, and companies need to understand how they're actually going to work with healthcare systems and healthcare professionals to address those changes. Because they're a challenge not just for us as companies with products, but also for patients and for healthcare professionals as well. That will need engagement with healthcare professionals. And of course, that engagement between pharma and healthcare professionals changed during the crisis. The overall number of engagements dropped. They went remote, and they are recovering now. But the world has changed. We're still more remote. And we're engaging with healthcare professionals whose job has changed. Because in the end, they're much more pressured and working in an atmosphere of much greater uncertainty than they ever did before. In terms of evidence and value, payers' budgets will be pressured in the next few years. And when payers are pressured in terms of budgets, they start to raise the bar in terms of expectations and evidence for new products that are coming in. And a strategic approach to really strong real-world evidence generation and engagement was already important pre-crisis, will be even more important now. Gwyn talked about this already, but I'll just show you the numbers. This is taking a look at Midas, and it's taking a look at some of the key therapy areas, hospital plus retail, looking at the value of each market versus the same period in 2019, so January 2020 versus January 2019, in terms of percentages over and under that we see on the market. And you can see that peak in terms of growth. It's all list price value, by the way, in March, as there was increased demand for medicines, people stocking up pre-lockdown, and then the decline because, of course, medicines were already there. And then a movement to recovery in the June period, where we are seeing a more stable situation. The way things play out is different across different therapy areas, and that's driven sometimes by the dynamics that we'd expect in terms of the severity of the disease, the need to address the disease rapidly, and other aspects. There are some small differences in immunology. We see a particularly strong recovery for Ireland, in the UK also. That was an area that saw above usual growth, and the reason why was because patients were being switched to subcutaneous versions of anti-TNFs because they could self-administer. So this remote healthcare system was driving changes in what was actually being used during that time. I don't know whether that was also the case in Ireland, but it would be interesting to see. In the anticoagulant area also, we saw a shift from warfarin, which requires clinic visits, to the new oral anticoagulants or direct oral anticoagulants that don't require those visits. And yes, red line on mental health. Maybe it's actually Brexit, since we don't see it for any of the other countries, but the UK appears to have been hitting the antidepressants quite hard during the COVID period. Turning to promotional activities. So this is our Channel Dynamics data, and it's looking at engagements, promotional contacts between the pharmaceutical industry and healthcare professionals. What we've got here is a view of 30 days in August 2020 versus August 2019. And we've divided all the channels that we measure into two types. So light blue, face-to-face, pretty self-explanatory. A rep in an office with a doctor or a face-to-face meeting. Everything else is remote. Remote could be digital channels, it could be e-details, or it could be as simple as email, or it could be telephone calls. And that's something that actually in some countries is very popular. You can see that the picture varies in detail, but in theme is very similar across the markets, and it's quite simple. Face-to-face fell. It fell dramatically in some countries, and whilst in most countries, for a period anyway, the absolute volume of engagements fell from historical norms, remote engagements made up for some of the lack of face-to-face engagements. And Ireland was no different in that respect. If we break down in a little bit more detail between August 2019 and August 2020, what was happening in the Irish market by all of the different types of channel that Channel Dynamics captured. In fact, the total volume rose slightly, 6.5% higher than August 2019. That was driven by postal mailing and email, so not interactive forms of engagement with doctors. And the more interactive forms of engagement with doctors, well, face-to-face had fallen dramatically. We saw a small but quite promising rise in e-detailing and phone detailing. So there was some of that remote interactive engagement. But the challenge for launch products, if I come back to them again, is of course, as companies launch, they do so with a significant amount of interactive engagement with doctors. It's unsurprising. Doctors have questions to ask about those products. As the launches start to flow again, and of course they've been low in Ireland to this point, it will mean that that interaction between the pharmaceutical company rep and the doctor needs to be reignited, whether it's remotely or face-to-face. So this needs to be carefully followed going forward. Let's turn lastly to payers. Here's why I'm saying that loss of exclusivity will help manage medicines budgets in the next 3 years during a period of recession, but it's not going to be quite as helpful as the loss of exclusivity we saw in the Great Recession. And that's not because the absolute figures in terms of current value of what could go off patent are remarkably similar. It was 28 billion worth of products that were moving off patent in the Great Recession, and it's 28 billion now. The challenge is that the market has, of course, grown. So what was 27% of 2009 EU5 value that was going off patent and saving on medicines budgets is only 18% of EU5 value now. And it's also different in nature. We've divided this between small molecules going off patent, which of course was a lot of the genericization in the last Great Recession, and biologics going off patent. And of course, in the last decade, we've significantly increased the number of biosimilars, and biosimilars are starting to come in faster than ever. And of course, that enables the lowest cost biologic to be chosen and make healthcare systems savings. But nevertheless, it's still a work in progress. What this means, I think, for the coming years is that payers will realise some savings out of loss of exclusivity, but will still be challenged on their medicine budgets. And when they do that, they will look at new products coming in, and they will raise the bar in terms of the data they expect to see from those new products to prove their worth. Here's a piece that we did, which was based on research of launches that happened actually pre-COVID. But what we were able to see, even for those pre-COVID launches that happened in pretty competitive therapy areas like diabetes, autoimmune, and immuno-oncology, was that the most commercially successful of those launches were also the launches that had the most real-world evidence publication productivity. What I mean by that is that they had more evidence of their real-world impact published by the company that was launching them in scientific journals, even when you take into account how long they'd been on the market and how many indications that they had. So whilst it's not driving, I'm going to be careful to say that because, of course, launch success is really multifactorial. The fact of the matter is the most successful launches are also the launches with the strongest evidence package behind them. And that was the case pre-COVID. I'm going to argue that it will be even more important as we live through these post-pandemic years. So this is my last slide, and then I'll hand over to Lisa Taylor, who will take you into more insights around that market access question. If we step back and say, well, what does COVID-19 really mean for the pharmaceutical industry? It will change our world for a long period of time and across all aspects of pharmaceutical company function. But oftentimes it's actually an accelerator rather than an initiator of change. What we've got to understand is what was already really important if you wanted to build competitive edge, and make sure we are doing it well and more in the post-COVID environment. So it was already the case that digital engagement with doctors and a multi-channel environment was starting to become a thing, and was actually associated with commercial success as well. Whilst face-to-face engagement will come back, it will be in a different mix. There will be a more hybrid approach, and we have to be effective at that more multi-channel hybrid approach. We need to understand that patients will have a more multi-channel and hybrid approach to the way that they engage with healthcare systems, and think about what that means for our products as well. And we need to make sure that we are constantly reinforcing the value of our products with the evidence package that we have. We've probably heard a lot about agility in the past, but we are in a situation where day to day things can change. Countries locked down, areas locked down. Every one of us has had to be more agile and digitally savvy in this environment, and that's not going to stop. We also need to make sure that we're using the best available evidence to make the decisions which we'll probably have to make faster and with greater precision than ever before. So thank you very much for listening to me there. I'll hand on to Lisa to take you through some of perspectives in the really important area of market access. Thank you.
Good morning. And thank you very much, Sarah, for walking us through some of the impact that COVID has had across the pharmaceutical industry. I wish to pick up on a few points that Sarah had made to us in relation to the innovative medicine. And I think you even said it was, the innovation that was going to drive the growth of the pharmaceutical market. But at the same time, also pick up on some of those payer points and remarks that you made around price, value and access, and what some of the payer responses will be in terms of facing that innovation and the questioning of how they can afford with these budgetary pressures and the exacerbation that COVID has made to them, how they can afford that within each of their systems, and what are some of the potential solutions or creative ideas that some of different markets, different pharmaceutical companies, even amongst yourselves in the audience, and different products are pursuing in this age of funding innovative new medicines. We've seen a paradigm shift. If we think about early 2000s, it was looking at simple molecule launches, large populations, traditional RCTs, placebo trials, hundreds of thousands, hundreds of dollars, maybe in the thousands of dollars, a lot of chronic therapy areas that were targeted in that era. In more recent times, and I think what most of us are familiar with, we did start to see biologics come out, obviously in immunology and RA specifically. A number of orphan drug therapy areas have been researched, and we're seeing those particular molecules launching, biomarkers as well as the traditional small molecules, probably more newer classes, lesser Me Toos that have been coming out and competing on the market. Prices per year have been steadily increasing with some of these more niche products or products that are serving far greater unmet need areas. In the last year or two, and I think onwards from now, is really a paradigm shift. This is where we're already seeing in the last year or two some of the cell and gene therapies, cell replacement therapies, gene therapies, modified gene therapies. We're seeing in the value department, not always the traditional RCTs. We're seeing more digitalization, real-world evidence, other novel ways to look at the RCTs. Biomarkers, genomics, patient-centered endpoints, longitude data are all starting to make up some of the methodologies or approaches that are used for the value proposition of these particular therapeutics that are coming onto the market. Typically, they're looking at niche disease areas or areas of, again, high unmet needs, and the probability of its success are wrapped around these value propositions, and the target patient populations that they're aiming for is moderate to high. Hundreds of thousands and even in the millions, as we've seen, particularly from gene therapies, and some of those discussions are being proposed for these therapies. And one can only imagine the funding challenges that payers already have, but we'll continue to see over these numbers of years as they're trying to scramble in some sense to not only make savings from their current healthcare and pharmaceutical drug budgets and healthcare systems, but also look to the longer term and what models would need to be implemented in order to enable some of these, particularly some of these products that really will have, life-changing abilities and influences onto the pharmaceutical market. A number of those I think you in the audience would be familiar with, but again, going back to some of the cell and gene therapies with Celgene and Bimarin, some of the launches there that will be happening very soon, typically in cancer areas, as we can see, but also Roche, Lilly, MorphoSys, etc., coming in, and you can see, looking at the world peak predicted sales estimates by 2024 in the billions of what some of these blockbusters could be looking at in terms of the impact on the drug budgets that we currently see. It's no wonder that we see from the payers a lot of challenge, a lot of skepticism, and a lot of uncertainty within the current model and the current systems and the current valuations, how these therapies can just be folded in and likely that will not be possible and will not be the case. This is only further exacerbated by what we've seen in 2020 with COVID. I mean, it was compounded, the budgetary pressures, both on the drug, but also on the totality of the healthcare system. High unemployment, reduced economic activity, reduced tax revenue will only add to the strain on the healthcare budgets. Deferred non-COVID treatments, such as Sarah was referring to before, will naturally peak after the crisis and continuing into next year, again resulting in high demand now as this backlog of patients start to come through and continue to come through into the healthcare services. If the governments, do keep, the RO under 1, resulting in repeated outbreaks, and if they fail to keep it under 1 and resulting in outbreaks in which we suspect, as Sarah mentioned before, where we're heading to currently, those financial pressures are only going to continue, and the economic, recovery is going to now look more like a zigzag-shaped recovery. Of course, if they are maintained below, doesn't necessarily look like the case from what we're hearing at the moment. Then there might have been a more steady state, and might have been, and maybe in some countries, a more, typical and expected U-shaped recovery from the financial viewpoint. The question is, with the exacerbation of COVID, as well as the expected new wave era of innovative therapeutics that are coming onto the market, what will this actually mean in terms of the drug budgets from the payer side? Now, we need to put in context that the drug spending is only a fraction of the totality of the healthcare costs. It varies across markets, but anywhere between 16 to 20, maximum sort of 21%. But given that, the healthcare system and policymakers and governments traditionally have always seen the drug budget as an easy target for those budget cuts. And I think in the short term at the moment, there is political sensitivity around COVID, and it's having somewhat of a protective effect on the totality of the healthcare budgets. Some governments, as we've seen headlines in the past month, are already seizing the opportunity, to make some symbolic gestures and capitalise on that public sentiment. We saw a while back pre-summer, the UK clearing of the hospital debts. But as the healthcare budgets start to focus towards the longevity of how the hospitals will be run and the longevity of COVID management, there will be a knock-on effect to other areas. And based on past experience, the drug budget is that low-hanging fruit for garnering some of these short-term savings. I think when we start to look sort of in the longer term, or maybe we refer to it as a world where there is a vaccine available or nearly about to be available, some of previous events, such as the 2018 crisis, which Sarah referred to, indicated then that the long-term healthcare spending tends to decline or at least stagnate following an economic disruption after initial lag of those type of events. We can maybe suspect that something similar will continue to happen here. I mean, the fallout of disruption of the care pathways during the pandemic, the scale of the COVID bill will only continue to rise the payers' expenditures. We already appreciate that the lower tax receipts during the pandemic may need to therefore be looked into and looked at from a pan-European level as well. The scope of the cuts will be influenced by the proposed central EU COVID fund, as we know, and the level of country debt. In that scenario, it's unlikely that the healthcare funding will continue to be protected in this longer term. And then the drug budget alone will not be the only lever looked at this post-COVID savings world, especially again at that point, given the small proportion that the drug budget does represent amongst the healthcare budget as a totality. Payers do expect that further pressure will come from managing the backlog of patients that Sarah also referred to, particularly referring to the oncology patients and the number of visits that is significantly down. And expect the fallout of the current focus on the COVID infections. Again, slowly over time, that backlog will be dealt with, and the screening, the diagnosis and the visits will start to increase, and therefore putting even more budgetary pressure on our healthcare systems. From an overall viewpoint, if we specifically focus on value, price and market access areas, we spoke with a number of EU payers over summer from a number of main EU countries to understand their viewpoint, as well as also looking at IQVIA internal data to reflect of what some of the key changes will be from the payer viewpoint in response to some of these budgetary pressures. Before COVID-19 was on the horizon, there were a number of countries that were already discussing policies and other various value and pricing changes that they would be looking into to balance what was then already a stretched budget. Now with COVID exacerbating that, is expected that those specific discussions will only be accelerated to move forwards. But again, still within the context of a particular payer country. So for instance, in drug budgets, yes, expected to be targeted for savings, absolutely. The protective COVID effect expected to go once that political sensitivity will ease, particularly as we look towards 2021. In the longer term, the systems are expected to be targeted and given limited headroom in any of these drug budgets, even though we've seen a number of those innovative therapeutics that are coming onto the market. Already France was talking as an example, tightening their list on SUS inclusion, their temporary authorization scheme, which a lot of these innovative products potentially use to get themselves established onto the market. Looking at primary and secondary care funding reform, looking at ways that they can have fixed payments for chronic diseases to already lower their budgets. The UK, as we know, or England, were already planning on broadening their CDF or their Innovative Drugs Fund, looking at integrated care systems, looking at home care, channel focus, etc. as well. When we look at evidence generation, we know that COVID has just disrupted trials. And looking therefore at evidence gaps, pharma will be required to provide robust patient-relevant data, particularly during these times, despite the COVID impact. And this is what we heard loud and clear from multiple payers and policymakers and governments. COVID likely, as Sarah referred to, provides an opportunity to facilitate the increasing payer acceptance of real-world evidence and virtual trials, and particularly how they might be incorporated into launch data, not just looking at post-launch or reassessment a couple of years down the track. With particular focus, as usual, on the innovative and the high unmet need areas. And again, those areas that are maybe reliant on data standard collection techniques as well. We know in Spain, for instance, Veltramed have already publicly spoken about real-world evidence and how they would like to facilitate its usage within risk-sharing agreements for very innovative drugs in order to ensure that they are able to have access to the innovative drugs, but they're specifically targeted where they need to be, and the evidence there will be to back it up. In Germany, we've also seen public forum discussions around the increasing acceptance of real-world evidence, albeit off a very small base or perception originally. But recent laws or policies have actually been passed to allow the GBA to request the manufacturers to look at real-world evidence for additional approaches in selected therapy areas. In France, we also have seen discussions in public forums around increasing the acceptance of conditional clinical ratings with real-world evidence being collected as part of that. From the HTA approaches, which Sarah has already mentioned as well, a number of markets, not all, but a number of markets did experience a backlog during the recent 6 months or so. It will take time for that backlog to be cleared, and I'll speak about that later. There was some prioritisation in some markets, particularly on innovation and in oncology. And we saw, for instance, in Italy, some of this propelled some policy changes that were already being discussed, but how they could utilise comparative clinical assessments before price negotiations in their national assessment system by IFA. And in UK, the NICE methodology review and consideration of the accelerated access pathways as well. So again, COVID is exacerbating some of these policy changes that might implicate some methodology or approach changes in the area of HTA. In the area of pricing and contracting, the pressure remains. Still expected to increase in the short term. In the longer term, payers will be looking to ensure price based on the value for the broader healthcare system. So again, understanding healthcare utilisation, obviously patient benefits as always, but also encouraging investment in and innovation, to Sarah's point around innovation driving the pharmaceutical market. We know, for instance, some potential savings. Germany, biosimilar pharmacy substitution plan for 2022. In Italy, bundled originator biosimilar tendering. It has already started in some regions, but now they're looking at some cross-regional tendering and purchasing. Spain, a broader adoption of the single preferred product per class for each of the hospital formularies has happened in some regions, and some regional formularies is expected to be scalable. In England, obviously reforms of the patient access system, or the PAS system, to look to other commercial arrangements and not necessarily just the blunt discounts that have been seen, albeit confidential, over the last number of years. I wish to jump into each of these points and then also focus on understanding a little bit more of some of the solutions that we might see coming from the payers. So looking at the trial disruption, by a survey that was conducted of top 20 pharma, 85% have reported delays. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. And despite the trial disruption, as I mentioned earlier, the payers have clearly said during our engagement with them in the last few months, they still expect robust patient-relevant trial data to be put in front of them when they're assessing these new innovative therapies. The relaxing of the evidence requirement is just not expected. Payers have said that they'll take it on a case-by-case basis, but they have also clearly said that in general, they're not looking to change their approach or methodology in a generalised way for products that are coming through this year and next year that may have some data gaps, etc., around them, or some of these delayed disruptions within their trial data as well. The question comes back to, and Sarah referred to this before, which is, can real world play a role in filling the data gaps? And the answer is absolutely yes. As always, a number of caveats stay behind it. I think in recent years, we have seen a significant increase in the real-world data included in HTA dossiers. We noted in a previous study about 43% between EU3, which was UK, France and Germany, and Canada from 2017 up to 2019 increase. But about 90% of that evidence was supplementary to the RCTs and not instead of. There wasn't necessarily any clear correlation demonstrated to date between the real-world inclusion and a positive HTA outcome, although we are looking very eagle-eyed as to how this trend continues. The current use for supportive RWE in HTA submissions, whether it be around a target patient population definition, adherence, persistence, obviously, appropriate comparators that are being used, external comparators for single-arm trials, particularly when you're looking at the orphan drugs or some niche population areas, extrapolation of the clinical trial outcomes or validation of some of those surrogate endpoints or secondary endpoints as well as things around the resource utilisation and utilities as well. With this background in mind, it is likely that the barrier to increasing the payer acceptance of RWE in lieu of the RCT is still too high, and it won't be the impact of COVID alone that will overcome that particular barrier. The payers still need to have a better awareness and a better understanding and a better acknowledgement of the real world data and more experience and confidence within the real world data if we're looking at it in terms of in lieu of RCT trials. Given that though, we're still seeing an increasing and successful usage of the real world data within HTA trials for upcoming products that we're seeing coming through and the evidence packages that are being put forwards, as well as a significant increase in post-launch real-world data collection, obviously beyond some of the typical safety data that we look at. And particularly this will be useful addressing some of these data gaps that we see post-COVID. If we look at the numbers of HTA trials, and particularly if we take the March to May period where COVID started to impact, and we compare that to a similar time from 2015 up to 2019 as an average in the light blue, and the 2020 March to May looking in the dark blue. I mean, here that we can see there has been a delay in the HTA publications across Europe, especially for the non-oncology treatments. So despite a lot of virtual working, as we know, and adaptation amongst each of these HTA bodies, the fast tracking of COVID-related appraisals whilst we were under lockdown did result in HTA bodies either slowing down, halting, or only putting prioritised assessments forward. This has created an overall backlog that Sarah referred to. Compared to the average in previous years, it's about 20 to 30%. The reduced activity in HTAs across Europe, though, was not seen significantly in Germany at all, as we can see through this. I think in speaking with some of the payers and the officials on the inside at the GBA and IGWIG, they already had for a number of time periods adopted various different virtual approaches and had methodologies that they were familiar with. They increased their FTE staffing model, and they specifically worked extremely hard to ensure that there was no backlog, and that was a directive coming down from their senior committees on how to ensure that that was the case at the time. I think on a positive note, payers have not yet become more stringent in the HTA making in terms of the positive assessments. What we actually also saw was that it was either neutral to increasing of the amount of positive HTA assessments that have actually come out in the last number of months. Now, we need to be careful because this is somewhat biased by the products that have gone through. And again, as I mentioned before, there was a prioritisation for niche products, high unmet needs, orphan drugs, and specifically oncology as well. And therefore driving a neutral to increased HTA outcomes seen in the last number of months. When we now go to understand sort of the continued prioritisation of what some of these HTA bodies will look at, we know that they'll be, highly innovative. Addressing unmet need is absolutely going to continue. We've seen this, publicly spoken about through England and looking at the innovation and in NICE reviews. In Spain, with discussions that we had there, again, although not always officially documented, that's the prioritisation they're looking to, and also tougher price negotiations at the national level. In terms of when we look at the Me Too products with some incremental efficacy, but might have some proven overall budgetary or healthcare savings, particularly from a healthcare utilisation or resourcing viewpoint, these will need to be particularly documented from a societal or healthcare utilisation point, but definitely will have a positive view as it is going through some of the HTA processes, albeit it's not up there in a high priority category. Already demonstrated in Italy through looking at their innovation algorithm and some of the products that they're assessing. However, those with Me Too, really with limited incremental efficacy and also limited cost effectiveness, limited healthcare utilisation or resource utilisation benefits, are really the products that have absolute low priority within the system now in the upcoming 6 to 12 months. Here is also where we see HTA systems that are looking into potential reviews of products that are already on market or those that are coming through, and particularly focusing on what level of assessment they'll get. And here an example in France with an ASMR of 4, those products there really facing a substantial risk of what discounts they're going to be expected to be negotiated or what public price levels they might expect looking back in comparison to over the past years as well. So the need to deal with this backlog will result in the assessments being prioritised. This will continue to happen even if it is in an informal manner across some of the HTA systems. And the delays will continue, albeit through some various IQVIA analyses that we looked at. There was probably around still sort of, 6 to 7 months to get through some of this backlog, and that was a lot of assumptions moving forwards that things would still be able to pick up pace around this September-October time period. And if we looked at the average time in the past that molecules had gone through the HTAs. When we asked the payers around just general affordability and budgetary measures, and potentially what are some of the ways that they're thinking about to manage the budgets given the list of therapeutics that they know is on the horizon, and given some of the gene therapies, the CAR T therapies, etc., that have come and are continuing to come through. The payers are really cautioning, although they are looking for innovative and alternative methods, they're still trying to understand the simplicity and the ease of implementation of any of these methods that they are discussing with yourselves as manufacturers or themselves, within their policy discussions. Really, simplicity is paramount, and, complex deals are only wishing to be pursued is absolutely necessary, and more as a last resort than as a standard. On top of this, they're really only looking for some of these innovative or creative ways for exceptional products only. Is it niche? Is it orphan drug? Is it particular high unmet need within an oncology area? No other possibility at that patient stage of the journey. Two solutions that you may have heard of, and we'll dig into in a moment, but looking potentially at contracts and linking them to instalment-based payments for outcomes, potentially Netflix-type subscription models, or looking at alternative payment contracts for cell and gene therapies, and again where these instalment-based can be joined up to potential other agreements or even other healthcare utilisation systems or resource utilisation as well. I want to dig a little bit into some of these solutions. There are some more simplistic ones moving up to some more complex ones. And irrespective of COVID, some were already being discussed pre-COVID times, and some are going to be exacerbated now with COVID. So typical low-hanging fruit, cost-saving measures, price cuts, access, generic biosimilar substitutions, funding management, special funding pots for innovation or special classes of therapy or special drugs. This particularly came to light, I think, as we all remember, as Xalfardi a number of years ago came to the market. Various different procurement, tendering and joint negotiation purchases in order to ensure as much pressure and I guess efficiency is put on those particular negotiations. And then some of the contracting-based, more traditional ones, albeit they were probably called innovative 15 years ago, around outcome, patient access schemes and financial agreements. And then what is more now, these new and emerging models, annuity, bundle payments, indication-based pricing. The cost-saving measures, I think I'll leave for the moment, given the time of where we are at. And if we actually dig maybe into some of the funding solutions. So in terms of some of the special therapy funds, as I alluded to before, was familiar seeing this in Xalfardi a number of years ago. Dedicated and specific therapy area funding. In England, we've also seen it in hepatitis C. We've traditionally seen it for a number of years also in England around the HIV consortiums and some of their joint tendering and negotiations, but also some of the funding and procurement power that they had to ensure those particular products in more sensitive areas were also given the right access to the right target patient populations. In terms of the national funding scheme, there have been multiple examples of these in the past. France and Italy, again, in Zolvardi especially come to mind, where this happened and they had ring-fence budgets or caps or based on patient numbers that were inserted in. I think more recently with Yescarta, there's been commercial agreements with England through the Cancer Drug Fund, also the planned broadening of the Cancer Drug Fund itself that we mentioned previously. In Italy, the Innovation Drug Fund that I referred to earlier, there's a specific algorithm that's utilised to assess products. Criteria can include those among the clinical value proposition, the unmet need, the differentiation, the competition, and then if a product is accepted, there is a fund of money which is about $1 billion that's utilised for these particular products and prioritised for these particular products as well. If we look into some examples around tendering and joint purchasing, I think this is an area that over the last couple of years has specifically expanded, again, to ensure the better use or the more efficient use of the budgets that have existed, whether it be at subnational levels or across multi-country levels. In Italy, we've seen examples of cross-regional purchasing. I mentioned it before from a tendering viewpoint for biosimilars, but also occurring from a purchasing viewpoint as well. And savings there and RA is particularly an area that they do this in with a group of five regions, adalimumab as an example. The bundling from the biosimilar tendering, as I referred to, with the originator with the biosimilar, this has continued in Italy. It started a number of years ago in one of the more forward-thinking central regions and is now expanding out. In Spain, we see in the retail sector for drugs some tenderings existing between 2021 and 2022, again looking to drive those prices down. I think maybe where more of the changes are happening are these joint assessments that are across multi-countries. The Benelux has actually been around for a number of years now already, although it has expanded the number of countries that have been in it. Ireland now one of them, as you would be familiar, and looking to explore collaborations and access and affordability as a totality. A more recent joint assessment on Zolgensma, as some of you may be familiar with, joint negotiation and purchasing. FINOS is also one that also has been around, but again, expanding the countries that are part of it up in the Nordic regions. Here they're working to look to evaluate the medicines and sharing from a health economic perspective. And then committees like these are really enabling these countries to work together from an HTA pricing and or reimbursement viewpoint, albeit there's still multiple challenges around the ins and outs of how these are actually worked and how each of the individual countries might take on some of the collaborative information, for instance, from shared HTAs that might come out of some of these joint negotiations and joint purchasing examples as well. If I look into multiple contracting modalities, as I mentioned before, I think 15 years or so ago, this was probably referred to as the innovative agreements. I think in today's world, we've seen a number of these existing already, particularly around the financial and outcome-based agreements. Italy is still a forerunner in these areas, primarily because of the way that they have set up some of their infrastructure of their system to collect data, notably their national level infrastructure around patient data, but also therapeutic patient journey or algorithms, and they utilise those particular patient registries to enable them to better understand the contracts, to reassess the contracts, and also reassess the terms and conditions around the contracts. Some more recent examples you can see here from Stringvalis and Blicento in Italy around the financial agreements, but also on the outcome-based agreements as well, which is linked to a metric to do with an outcome, whether it be looking at a patient-related outcome or a clinical biomarker outcome. But again, Italy also commonly doing this, and primarily in the area of oncology as well, which is where a lot of these patient registries have been set up. If we look at patient access schemes, in addition to the patient access scheme that we've already mentioned in England, you'd be familiar with, in Spain, the Veltamed, looking to facilitate the risk-sharing agreements and also utilising RWE, as I mentioned previously. In Sweden, for Kymera, some of you would be familiar with, taking into account the benefit of the PAS and therefore being able to show that improvement in the cost effectiveness, and that was part of the negotiation and the discussions as well. If we look at some of the new modalities that are coming through really off the back of some of these new therapeutic and CAR-T and gene therapies that are either come on or will be coming onto the market, given the substantial costs within the whole chain of research, development, supply, production, and then out to each of the patients. Annuity, bundle payments and indication-based pricing are certainly things that we're already seeing and discussing on the market amongst manufacturers, companies and payers. Implementation is always dependent on legislation hurdles and willingness for any of these to be adopted. Therefore, even words like bundle, as we know, are sort of an illegal terminology in some markets. You know, indication-based pricing is not necessarily on list price for the referrents, but on net prices, where we've seen current examples. So please be wary of the actual implementation of these can look vastly different across a number of different markets. We know, for instance, in France, if we talk about annuity-based payment models, it's not specifically not actually allowed in the current legislation, but you know, CEPS has indicated it's something it's not going to consider now, but hasn't closed the door to the future. In Germany, there's a grey area. There's not necessarily any legal specificity that calls it out, but the current legislation doesn't necessarily allow it, except, you know, we're seeing potential discussions starting to rise at the Krankenkassen level, so at a sub-national level from the independent insurers. In Italy, there's no hurdles, but again, the power to negotiate this with IFA is probably where the real challenges will come through. What we see with, you know, an example here is of Zynteglo. I mean, the cost was spread over 5 years, an initial instalment, as you can see, of 315K, and more instalments only if the blood transfusions are avoided, and every extra transfusion for every year, then there's another instalment of payments. That type of setup of different payments over time has its own challenges. As we know, payers tend to only look 1 to 2 years in advance of what particular funding or pot of money that they have. So there's a lot of discussion, particularly that this is extended over a 5-year period. If I turn to indication-based pricing, this is a common question that we get and something that we're seeing more happening within the market. But as I mentioned before, it's not true indication-based pricing on a list price level, but really down to how different net prices might be reflected in the system, and typically happening with products that go through a hospital funding system where there's been better data collection to enable some of the background analyses for this. We've seen this commonly in Italy. Here you can see the example with Avastin. We've also seen this commonly in Catalonia in Spain, again, more in the hospital level for informal agreements, melanoma as an example. In the UK, obviously a collaboration between the NHS, and for those of you at Roche would be familiar, looking at some of the indication pricing concepts, you know, particularly looking around using the SACT data set for specific products there as well. So a number of different solutions are being looked at by the payers pre-COVID, and a number of them will be exacerbated by what we've seen with the budgetary pressures of COVID. The cost-saving measures are the low-hanging fruit. We'll continue to see them as we already have. What was already in discussion pre-COVID will now be speeded, and smaller savings are expected from that bucket. The funding management with special therapy funds, we expect that this will continue. it's not a long-term sustainable policy for governments, but it is a way to divide the budgetary funds that they have for drugs and ensure that they can prioritise for upcoming number of therapeutics as they do their horizon scanning. The procurement and joint purchases, we expect this to continue, and we expect it to continue at an increasing pace, whether it be between regions within different countries or more notably so some of the multi-countries. We appreciate there is different visions of what each of these procurement or tendering or negotiation committees are trying to achieve, and the amount of information that they share and how they actually execute and implement within each of their local countries. But again, this is definitely taking pace across Europe. The traditional contracting, or what was innovative contracting, still continues to increase. We see more on the financial contracting side than the outcomes. I do believe that with the advent and scalability of increased real-world evidence and payer acceptance of it, there will be a shift in high unmet need, innovative products to accepting some of those outcome agreements, but again, only when no other options, have been available in order to get some of these much needed therapeutics out onto the market. The new and emerging models, it's still very early to tell, but I think we can all see from the drug budget impact over the next number of years that the existing models that exist with the payers will not be sufficient in order to afford some of these well-needed therapeutic innovations that are coming to the market. So more discussions on these. We cannot underestimate some of the legislative challenges and implementation hurdles. But we do expect a lot of heated discussion over the next 10 years or so in the longer term view to really see how some of these new, and particularly the financial models that go beyond the 1 or 2 year time period for payments, can eventuate into the market. I would like to finish up there. And thank you very much for your time. I would like to call upon our colleagues and other speakers that we've had this morning. Oliver, Gwyn, and Sarah, and myself will now be available for a panel discussion to answer some of those questions that have been coming through the IM already. I believe we will now all come on screen so you're able to see us and conduct that panel discussion.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. That was great. And thank you, Sarah, beforehand, and indeed, Gwyn, for your introduction. Well, look, there's about 170 people in our audience, and there was lots and lots to digest there, lots to think over and to analyse afterwards. I understand the presentation is being recorded and it will be available on the EFA website. So we have a little bit of time for some questions, and we said some really interesting questions, some of which are big policy questions, like what does Sarah and Lisa think should be the Irish policy and have a life sciences policy, or how will a global fund for COVID be shared out or be created? It's probably a little bit above your pay grade to answer that, but I'm going to try to focus on a couple of questions that, firstly for Sarah and then for Lisa, that I hope will capture some of the questions that have been put. So Sarah, remind me, the idea here is that governments are under budgetary pressure, that's for certain. And in some degree, they manage the flow of new medicines and the methodologies put in place to assess those as a budget control measure. And that's, of course, from an industry perspective, that's not very desirable. So going back to the existing spend, I know everyone focuses on the LOE, opportunities for LOE savings. Remind us again, you were saying that in the big five in Europe, there's about 18% of budget is likely to be subject to LOE in the next 3 or 4 years up to 2025, and half of that in the biologics biosimilar space. If that is the case and savings are achieved there, where else in the existing spend might governments look for achieving savings and move away from the temptation to achieve savings simply by reducing the flow of new medicines?
Okay, it's a great question, and I think that we should be very mindful of the fact that one of the levers that governments have to, make medicine savings is there. Absolutely, there will be some big losses of exclusivity, but it's not as big a lever as they had during the crisis. So they have to look elsewhere, as you very rightly point out. I think that clearly a first part is to say where they can make more savings on existing products that are multi-source. In most countries, of course, we've improved the efficiency with which we use loss of exclusivity to make cost savings and extract savings. But I think if we're honest with ourselves, particularly in the biologics area, we are not 100% there at the moment. We've been learning how loss of exclusivity can lead to the use of best value biologics. There's still some way to go with existing biologics that have lost exclusivity, as well, of course, as the biologics that will lose exclusivity to come. In some countries, not necessarily in Ireland, but in other European countries, I think there will be further rounds of delisting of products from reimbursement, as there were in the 2008 onwards economic crisis, because you're still seeing products that could be essentially over-the-counter medicines moving through the prescription medicines arm. And I think that overall there'll be, and this is not just focused on medicines, a focus on improving efficiencies in healthcare systems. It's worth reflecting that delivery of healthcare that can be delivered remotely potentially reduces pressure on healthcare facilities, and in the longer term could even reduce the size and shape and the investment in those facilities. Now, that's not something that happens next year, but I'm pretty certain it occurs to policy makers. I know it has in the UK, and economic challenge could exacerbate that change.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Lisa, we had a very good question there about whether the scarcity of data and indeed COVID restrictions might be putting a brake on the development of outcomes-based measurements and real-world evidence-based payments. And I think that question probably came from an Irish perspective, where we have been behind to a large degree in the use of those models. And bearing in mind also, I think that both of you said that the best idea is to keep things simple, that highly complex reimbursement or payments on a product basis are likely to be difficult in the next few years. But data, do you see a problem in that the COVID restrictions have caused for the gathering and the creation of data-based outcomes and our outcomes-based reimbursement models for a market like Ireland?
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. I won't profess to be an expert of the Irish market, but let me put forward some of the first-hand discussions and excerpts that we've spoken about with payers in some of the other European markets. And what you said, Oliver, I cannot emphasise enough. It came very clearly in over 30, 40 discussions that I've had in the last few months on this topic. Simplicity is key. Even pre-COVID, simplicity was key, but now simplicity is key for any type of data collection arrangement that is going to be linked specifically to an outcome that is measured, or a price, or a reimbursement, or a funding decision, or an expectation of a target patient population, whatever it might be. Where the payers have appreciated that they can't always just go back to let's try to have minimal data collection once a product is out on the market in terms of an outcome agreement. They have tried to say that they're more open in discussing any financial or alternative payment contracting agreements, and therefore taking the analyses away from on-the-ground data collection to looking more at a financial analysis that can be done at a different level and hasn't as been interrupted by COVID. So whether it be looking at sales data in certain regions and extrapolating out, looking at EMR data, various different hospital data sets, or even historical data to understand what some of these payment or financial agreements will be. In going back to the outcome agreements, and I specifically will bring up Italy again, some of this will also depend on the continuation of them post-COVID as to what data infrastructure was already set up and the impact, as you mentioned, that has had by COVID. So in the instance of Italy, they had extremely good national health coverage of two different data patient registries. One was specific for individual data patient registries. It has been impacted somewhat because the reliance of the data input feed to that is specifically on the interaction between the physician and the patient. And then the physician is expected to fill an online form, or in some instances a paper form still, for that to be inputted into the patient registry. So there has been a slowdown, and therefore we would expect by only a matter of months, but a slowdown of some of the current agreements, at least to get a better understanding of what the analyses would be for any decisions that would be made off that, or any payments that would be paid back. The second data patient registry that Italy has is a more therapeutic level and more at an algorithm to understand the patient journey and how they go through from one drug to another, primary, secondary care. Again, this is more in the oncology area, and it's scaled up to look at a national level. Obviously, the registry doesn't exist at the totality of the volume. There's certain averages that are looked to scale up. Now, that particular data set, the majority of that has continued to move forwards in the sense that it hasn't necessarily relied on a physical patient-physician discussion. Yes, it still relies on patients coming into the system and continuing a journey. So yes, absolutely some disruption and some slowdown there. But still, from what we've heard, they'll still enable a number of analyses on that particular data set. Now, Italy, I would say in this respect, is probably ahead of other countries because of some of these systems that they already had in place. And therefore, the continuation of those specific outcome agreements is going to be more agreeable to them versus other markets where they hadn't had such detailed structure already. So going back to the original, simplicity is key. At the moment, for the next 6 to 12 months, payers are really interested in financial payments only when necessary for innovative or oncology or niche product therapy areas. And in the longer term, are still looking towards financial or alternative payment models as a way of the future for these type of agreements.
All right. Thank you very much, Lisa. Sarah, I think we'll take time for one more question because we're slightly over now, if that's all right. Gwyn, if you agree with that. Sarah, going back to one of your slides, are indeed two things, I'm putting them two together. I think in one of the slides you said that Ireland is showing the same pattern of usage of certain medicines in certain therapy areas as the EU 5 countries. Is that correct? Yeah, so...
It depends by therapy area. Obviously, with diabetes, all of the EU countries tracked very closely, and there's variations elsewhere. Sorry, Oliver, carry on.
Yeah. But at the same time, even in the last year, we see the uptake of new substances is low. It is quite different from Germany, France, isn't it, and Italy. And we know from our other measurements, of course, that Ireland is very slow with the uptake of new medicines. We're sort of back at the end of the queue, and a situation we want to fix. So how do we? Does that suggest that the composition of what we use in Ireland in terms of medicines, or the composition of spend, is somewhat off kilter? How would you comment on those two things side by side as a final comment today?
Okay, good point. So firstly, let me just emphasise that the data I showed was simply about whether the innovative product appeared in the market. It didn't say anything about how it did. And that's something that we will be researching because we think that, it's really important to take this as a leading edge indicator of how the industry is going to be doing in the future. But what I can say is that from our data, we do not see a large number of new active substances entering the Irish market. It's below the historical average. And I always interpret that as a problematic, a worrying sign, because we know that there are hugely valuable new medicines which are being approved at the EMA level. And those hugely valuable new medicines are not necessarily making their way into the Irish market as rapidly as perhaps they are other European Union countries. Undoubtedly, the mix of the Irish market can be impacted by that, absolutely. And I think that it needs to be monitored. I suspect that in the scheme of policy questions that healthcare systems have to deal with, in the height of the crisis, policymakers could see the introduction of innovation, unless that innovation, of course, was directly to treat or prevent COVID, as luxury worry. But in the long term, both the backlogs that have been created of non-COVID treatment and the question about how the best new medicines can come in to treat patients are genuine major questions that they will have to address. And I think that our data and the industry have a role in setting out objectively what the situation is here.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Gwen. Thank you, Lisa. And that is indeed a good summary of it, Sarah. The search for value, which is entirely understandable, we would argue shouldn't be focused simply on creating a higher barrier for new products to have to jump over. Its value across the entire medicines expenditure budget, and it's having a medium-term outlook on how that value is and what role it plays in healthcare systems and indeed in the health of the economy and in society itself. So, Gwen, thank you very much for organising your participation in our Thinking series on behalf of IQVIA. Thank you very much to all the attendees, the people who participated. Thank you for your questions. We didn't go through them serially, but they'll be up there. We may find a way to answer those which are in the scope of IQVIA, which you can answer them. And at this stage, I just want to say good morning. Thank you to all, and we look forward to the next Thinking series event coming up soon from IFA. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.